until the crowd cleared before they entered the inner doors together. "Nice fix, Janus," Ryler said. "Sorry those crater heads took it for granted." Janus shrugged. "It's not a big deal. Everyone's busy, and most don't realize how dangerous a blown lock could be. We hadn't had one in years. They're jamming all the time now. I think people just forget how thin the margin of error is. The survivor watches over the vigilant." Janus nodded. "And the void doesn't forget or forgive." Chapter 1. Note from the author. Lore. What is a duster? Most of the people of Irkalla spend their entire lives inside the confines of their dome or habitat. Those who step outside the airlock are colloquially known as dusters, with varying positive and negative connotations. There are further distinctions between dome maintenance personnel who stay within the critical 6 and 126 second time limits to brain damage in case of suit breach, external workers and researchers who transit between facilities within the same settlement, and the real dusters who travel the long, dangerous roads between settlements. The mark of a real duster is the paradoxical acceptance of their imminent death and fastidious efforts to prevent it. Dusters are careful, independent, slow to trust, and relentless in action. Many have elaborate beliefs concerning the void, the stars, and the landscape of Irkalla. More than armor glass or polysteel, the Duster's will to live makes human life on Irkalla possible. Sector 6, Prime Dome Planet. Irkalla, Survivors Refuge 4452.2. 10 Interstellar. The inner doors were still closing behind them when Ryler took off his helmet, revealing ebony skin and long black hair. He said something which Janus didn't hear because he still had his helmet on and sealed. Ryler rolled his eyes. Janus waited until the door had fully closed and locked before taking his helmet off. What? Ryler gave him a crooked grin. "I was going to commiserate with you about how some people should just be grateful you're there to keep them alive. But I can also see where they're coming from." Janus raised an eyebrow. "The time is money, guy? When's the last time you saw an extra life for sale in a commissary?" Ryler smiled. "Never mind. It's just, you work a double shift almost every day. You should be using your skills to do more important things than cleaning leachate from the recyclers. Something with sector maintenance, somewhere you wouldn't have to deal with the jerks." Ryler was a good friend. They'd met in mech school, where Janus hadn't understood why someone from a hub family like Ryler would be in a class with him until their instructor called on Ryler to teach a more complex concept in his place. Ryler was a genius when it came to multidisciplinary applications of materials, and the two struck up a friendship around their shared enthusiasm to make things better. Once Janus accepted that Ryler wasn't just acting out of pity or rebelling against his parents. Ryler Abraxas was a good guy, but he also had blind spots when it came to the limitations of being born anywhere other than Prime Dome. Janus started walking toward the decon center, forcing Ryler to jog a few steps to catch up. "I mean it, man," Ryler said. "I know you're doing this for Callie, but you're allowed to want things too." "For one," Janus responded, "jerks are like leachate. It doesn't matter whose recycler it is. It's always going to produce slimy, unusable crap that gums up the works." Ryler guffawed. "Okay, wise one. You have me there? What's your second point? No one wants to clean the recyclers, so it's the one job a refugee like me doesn't have to fight to keep. He left Ryler's privileged position as a Prime Dome elite unspoken, but Ryler winced anyway. What were you doing out there anyway? Janus asked. Hey, you don't work early shift. You know me, Ryler said, holding the door to the decon center open for him like Janus was some hub administrator, instead of being covered in desiccated crap. Someone told me they found some weird shit stuck in one of the iron mesh filters, and I wanted a sample before they burned it out. And just what are you going to use it for? Janus asked. Oh man, I have so many good ideas. I was thinking some sort of self-sustaining lubricant, except what's the opposite? Glue, Janus said, trying hard to keep from laughing. Glue? Genius. Gotta write that down, Ryler said, following Janus into the bowels of the decon center. Janus shook his head. Ryler might have had the privilege of well-placed parents and the best education the Prime Dome could offer. But he genuinely deserved the small comforts and flexibility Dome admin afforded him. He was always coming up with something new, and some of it was even practical, which Janus appreciated. Someday, something Ryler thought up was going to save a lot of lives. Janus was sure of it. He was less comfortable with Ryler's family's devotion to the Wayfinders and the cult of the survivor. Janus' uncle, Janus Invarian, had raised Janus to be suspicious of anything the cryptic tech priest said, because Uncle Ivan was one of the only people who made it out of Prometheus Base alive. Ryler and his family treated him with something approaching reverence, which Ivan hated. That was why Janus didn't get to invite Ryler to their home that often, even though they were close. The two friends quieted down as they entered the crowded locker room. Early shift was over, and since Janus and Ryler had been delayed by the malfunctioning airlock, most of the others were already stripped down to their main shift coveralls. Ryler hurried to get out of his suit, but Janus hooked his into the diagnostic machine, uploading his data for analysis as he calmly undid the locks on his gloves and boots. Someone leaned against the machine in front of him, and he looked up. It was his shift manager, Meg. She was a wiry, weathered woman with short, graying hair, who Janus respected because she was damn good at her job, even though he didn't always like what she had to say. Good shift today, Janus. Thanks, Janus answered, picking his boots up and pulling the connection to the diagnostic machine. You're 3 units behind schedule, Meg said. First the compliment, then the crap. It was a classic management move. The open-faced crap sandwich. The units I fix break down less often. I've checked. I know. That's not what early shift gets paid to do. We get the most machines to run at any given time, so that more flow can go through them during main and late shift. You need to make your quotas, even if that means we just have to fix them again tomorrow? Janus asked. Meg nodded. Now you get it. Paychecks and job security. What more could you ask for? She said with a grin. And listen, it's really impressive you got so many machines up to full function. Put in the time, work your way up. Maybe you can change the system. Janus had more to say, but knew his battle wasn't with Meg. She was just doing what sector maintenance wanted her to do. Yes, ma'am? I'll do better tomorrow. Meg walked off. She was a good boss, as far as early shift bosses went. Any manager could feed their shift workers a line of crap, but not all of them bothered with both slices of bread. Good to know I wasn't the only one to notice you were slow and Varian, a new voice said. Janus turned to find Lyra Allencourt staring him down across the locker room. It looked like this morning was going to be a double-decker. What did I do to piss you off now, Lyra? You blocked the airlock when Craig and I were trying to get through. Lyra was Craig Bennon's sidekick, and Craig was the lead candidate for aspirant in this year's trials. This close to the planet-spanning competition, it gave her an almost unbearable amount of clout, especially since she'd made it clear she hated Janus's guts from the moment they'd first met, years ago. Sorry, Janus said, heading toward his locker. He didn't have time to fight. He had another shift to work. Sorry, Lyra said mockingly. You interfered with the aspirant Invarian. You slowed us down and took away from our training time. We might come in second instead of first because of parasites like you. Better than dead, Janus said, louder than he'd meant to. The locker room's background conversational buzz died out. What was that, Invarian? Lyra asked, walking toward him. Take it easy, Lyra, Craig Bennon, the actual lead aspirant candidate, said, standing up from a nearby bench. Lyra hesitated. We all know you mean well, Janus, Craig said, a relaxed smile on his square-jawed face. Lyra's right, though. First place means prestige, and a much bigger prize for the winner's dome. It's big stakes out there, my friend. And the whole dome is depending on us. Everything about Craig shouted that he was dumb royalty. From the broad shoulders he got from the extra rations to the smooth, rich cadence of his tutored voice. He was like Ryler, with an extra helping of entitlement and none of the grit beneath his nails. He was right about one thing, though. Placing first in the trials earned the winning team valuable resources only the cult could provide, such as exotic materials, advanced blueprints, or process optimizations only the Wayfinders could provide. An entire department of Prime Dome's administration was dedicated to training high potentials like Craig. He'd basically been bred to be an aspirant, and someone so far on the opposite end of the spectrum, like Janus, should have instinctively folded in front of his magnificence. Except Janus didn't. You don't compromise safety unless it's really life or death, Janus said, stowing his boots in his locker. Are you kidding me? Lyra almost shouted. Craig, are you hearing this? Ryler joined the fray. You're both still candidates, Lyra, and you can't compete if you blow out in training. By using the lock, the way it's designed to function? Lyra retorted. That's a backup system, Ryler said. We know. It's a backup system, Craig said, walking over. It's our job to evaluate the risks and make the best decision under the circumstances. You think there are going to be safety officers out there during the trials? Lyra wasn't done. Are you really going to side with a maintenance tech over an aspirant on this, Ryler? Of all people, I would have thought you would see which side the Wayfinders would choose. Janus let them argue, stripping off his suit and carefully stowing it in his locker. He knew that if he'd been a real primer, even a poor one, he'd have joined in, defended his friend, confronted Lyra for the constant and unjustified needling. He might have gone as far as to submit a harassment complaint or file for a restraining order. Doing that as a Promethean working 2 jobs would have been suicide. His family needed those paychecks, and no one was going to replace his suit until it reached the end of its work life or suffered a breach. Even minor wear and tear could become a fatal weak point. A little care and a touch of discretion was the difference between a survivable event and a fatal one. Is he seriously ignoring us? Lyra asked more loudly than she needed to, playing to the room. Janus knit her eyes. I don't know much about the trials, or the prizes, or the training you go through. I hardly know you at all. What I do know is what happens to micromotors when you try to run them without lubricant, how hard it is to force a door open or closed if the seals lock, and what happens to a human body when the void gets to it. I have a shit job. I spend early shift making sure your crap flows through the pipes so it can become something useful. You don't want my job, and I can't do it if I'm dead. So if your training is so important you need to put an entire shift at risk to save 2 minutes, use a different airlock. He slammed his locker shut. Ryler winced, and someone in the room clapped before Lyra glared him into silence. She looked back at Janus, eyes full of fury, and said, "You'll pay for that, Invarian. No matter how hard you try, or who you suck up to," she said, eyes flicking to Ryler. "You'll never be more than outsider trash." Craig put an arm around her shoulder and led her away. Come on, Lyra. It's not all his fault. His parents killed their dome by accident. If we had that kind of legacy, we'd be cowards too. Janus had to steady himself against his locker, or the rage he felt at their casual slander of his dead parents would have showed. He'd feel himself shaking. Feel the ugly purple and red bruise of hatred tighten his hands into fists, but he forced it down for Callie, for his parents' name, and because it wouldn't do him any good. He wasn't powerless because he'd been right or wrong, because he was poor, or because he was a mechanic on the early shift. He was powerless because of who he was, and always would be. Chapter 2. Sector 6. Prime Dome Planet. Irkalla survivors. 4452.2. 10 Interstellar. With the locker room incident behind him, and another full shift in front to try to clear his head, he walked with long, fast strides, and the sleeves of his coveralls pushed up, trying to maintain a balance of speed and sweat. Fixing the airlock and fighting with Lyra had cost him time he didn't have, and he was mad as hell. But starting the main shift, tired and grimy, would only make his day miserable, sure as a clog in the recyclers would. Most people in the dome thought the hardest thing about surviving in the void was getting enough water and breathable air, and it was true that exposure to vacuum was the fastest way to die. Likewise, the Dome City's agronomists would boast that it was Prime Dome's scaled biomass production facilities that allowed other Dome Cities, cave habitats, and caravans to survive on their mostly barren world. But heat was the deadliest mass murderer on the planet. Heat was the invisible threat that built up, that slowed things down and frayed tempers. You could speed up algae growth cycles or divert power to scrub excess carbon dioxide from the air. But without an atmosphere or bodies of open water, heat had to be reflected or radiated away, and that took time. It was a constant struggle against the system sun, against the press of the tens of thousands of human bodies living in each settlement. And that was why Janus made a point not to bring any of it into his home. As the dome polarized like a giant helmet visor, shutting out the system primary and muting the distant stars, Janus let Lyra Allencourt, Craig Bennon, and the jerk at the airlock go, radiating them back into the void to be someone else's problem. He reached the hab building, took the stairs down to the fourth sublevel, and walked past 6 identical doors before coming to the apartment he shared with his little sister and uncle. He thought of Ryler's suggestion one more time that he should apply for a higher-level job within the maintenance division so he wouldn't have to deal with frustrations like today, then shook his head. Ryler meant well, but ambition and resentment were both luxuries a Prometheus-based refugee couldn't afford. He palmed a keypad, and the locking mechanism disengaged. He gently swung the door inwards. The main room combined cooking, dining, and living space, leaving one small room for his uncle to sleep in, and one that Janus shared with his kid sister. His uncle was where Janus left him that morning, seated in his favorite chair with a mug of something strong in his hand. At some point during early shift, the older man had passed out, head back against the headrest, cup miraculously unspilled. Janus set his bag down and went to lift the cup from the man's hands.